Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm very excited to have a frequent guest come on my program who's been doing this for we've been doing this for over 3 years now. Jonathan
Really?
Neville, welcome back to the program.
Hey, Steve, it's great to be back with you.
And
Has
speaking
it
of
really been 3 years we've been doing this?
been crazy, it's been 3 years now. It's been over 3 years, and it kind
Wow.
of comes full circle because the first interview I did with you was about Moroni's America,
Okay.
first edition.
Yeah.
And now we are doing Moroni's America 2.0, the second
Mhm.
edition. And I wanted to just say, first of all, ask you about some of the changes or some of the stuff that you've added onto this book. But before we get started, how you doing today?
Doing great. We're down in Utah right now at our condo in Utah
And
instead of our studio in Oregon. So,
oh, that's right. Explains the different background. That's right. Okay, because I'm
yeah.
so used to use your studio up there in Oregon, and I forget that you're often in Utah as well. So basically, Jonathan and I have had a great friendship over the last few years, and really have done, I think, a lot of ground breaking stuff on our channel, talking about a lot of the ground breaking work that Jonathan's been doing. And what's so
Mhm.
fascinating is actually, I remember when I was on Mormon Stories a couple years ago. And I had talked about how Richard Bushman believes there were two sets of plates. And I remember John DeLynn was like, "What?" And I remember you calling me after the interview and said, "Steve, did you say that Richard Bushman said there were two sets of plates?" I said, "Yeah." I said, I said, "Yeah, him and I just had an off-camera conversation. He just kind of brought that up, saying something like, yeah, I think Jonathan's onto something with those two sets of plates and stuff like that."
Yeah.
And now it's kind of become kind of like a mainstream idea. There's been pushback,
Yeah.
of course, but a lot of people like Don Bradley and others, people have jumped on that idea
Mhm.
of two sets of plates, which is one of the things that made its way into this book. So maybe we can
Right.
jump off there and then have talk some more about this great book.
Okay, sure. In fact, I have a copy of kind of the original one that looked
Oh
like
yeah.
this.
Uh-huh.
And the whole idea behind that book was to offer a North American setting for the Book of Mormon that went through chapter by chapter.
Hmm.
And that book's been out, I think, about 8 years, 8 or 9 years, something like that. And so some time ago, people asked me to do a second edition because there have been so many new developments since I wrote that book originally. And when I went back to look at that book, I thought, boy, I was ignorant back then on the first edition because I didn't know about the two sets of plates. I didn't know about Jonathan Edwards. I didn't know about a lot of these things. And so I thought, yeah, okay, let's do a second edition. And as you said, it looks like this. There's hardback and softback. And the idea here is to really update people on all the new developments, and also not only involving the origin of the Book of Mormon with translation, two sets of plates, those kind of things, but also some nuances about the setting of the Book of Mormon that I didn't know about or understand when I did the first edition.
I actually think maybe we should backtrack because I'm thinking it's been a few years since you've been on to talk about specifically this book. And actually, the book opens up with this idea of you traveling to the old world and encountering Mars Hill and realizing that there's an actual geographic spot that the Apostle Paul was at that we can identify. And then you
Uh,
had grown up basically with the idea that the Mesoamerican model was the model that the Book of
yeah,
Mormon was based on, that basically you thought those events took place there. But as you kind of dug into it, and started investigating, you kind of came to the conclusion that actually it looked most likely the events of the Book of Mormon actually took place in the heartland. Maybe just talk a little bit about that background, and then
okay,
we can go and talk about some of the additions you made to the second.
sure, sure. Well, what you're referring to, we were living in Europe, and my family took a trip down to Greece. My sister was going to the university in Athens. And my dad took us up to Mars Hill and said, "This is where the Apostle Paul preached." And I hadn't really paid much attention to scriptures, at that point. And when he pointed it out, and I read that, and I thought, "Wow, this is a real thing. This really happened." And so that's kind of guided my approach to religion ever since, that it's a real thing that really happened. And of course, as you mentioned, when we were growing up, we kind of were taught the hemispheric idea, and which never seemed that plausible, but that's what we were taught. We didn't give much thought to it. But then as I went to university at BYU and I met with the people at farms, primarily they were doing conferences and things, and they persuaded me. I had a class from John Sorensen. They all persuaded me that the Book of Mormon took place in Central America, which, when you're a college student, you kind of think your professors know what they're talking about, right? And especially in a religious context at BYU. And so I accepted that. And I went along with it for many years, actually. In fact, when I was on my mission, I used to tell people I bought a book about the Mayans and told everybody the Book of Mormon is the story of the Mayans and stuff. But then, in more recent years, maybe 10 years ago, I met through a mutual friend, Rod Meldrum, and he took me on a tour to Ohio and showed me all these in the museums and the mounds and all that at the national parks, all this information that seemed to corroborate pretty well with the Book of Mormon. That's when I started digging into the whole thing. And I was curious how we ever got sidetracked into Central America, and it was because of these articles in the Times and Seasons that have been attributed to Joseph Smith. We've talked about that before, but maybe some of the viewers here don't know about it. But there were articles published in the 1842 Times and Seasons that said that the ruins in Central America were left by the Nephites, and they were signed with the initials ED for editor.
Hmm.
So no one really knows who wrote them. Joseph Smith was the nominal editor. It listed him as the editor on the Times and Seasons, which in retrospect is kind of ridiculous because it also lists him as printer. And no one believes he was in there setting type and
Right.
running the printing rooms. And it was no more likely that he was actually editing anything because he wasn't an author. He wasn't an editor. But for many years, it was these articles were included in teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, so they kind of became almost canonized.
Hmm.
And people just assumed that, well, that's true. If that's true, then the Cumorah can't be in New York because it's too far away.
Right.
That's what led to this whole two Cumorahs idea, what I
Exactly.
call the Mesoamerican two Cumorahs theory, or M2C. So I was persuaded that what Joseph and Oliver said about Cumorah was true, but then people wondered, well, how does it fit? And so I wrote the first book to offer a scenario or a geography of the Book of Mormon in North America that incorporated all the scriptures. And it required some reinterpretation of a lot of well-known passages. For example, the narrow neck of land. Everybody asks me, so where's the narrow neck of land? I say it's in Ether 1020. It's the only place it's referenced in the whole scripture, and it was a Jaredite location. But people have this idea that there is an hourglass shape, which kind of fits Central America and, that type of thing. And then I pointed out that, well, a narrow neck of land was a common term that used by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and they referred to small areas in the Boston area, in Delaware, those kind of places. So it was not a continental setting anymore for me. The second thing was I assumed that the Nephites traveled by rivers, which all ancient people did. And in North America, that kind of fit everything. And the third one, I guess, was the idea that the land northward and land southward are relative terms, not proper nouns. And, there in Florida, for you, let's say Georgia is the land northward, but if you're in New York, Georgia's the land southward. So it's all a frame of reference. And that's how I interpret the Book of Mormon now. And then I guess one other thing was the Sea West. Everybody says, well, where was the Sea West if this all took place in the heartland of America? And I pointed out that in the Bible, they translate the word for the Nile River as a sea,
Hmm.
and that fits with the Mississippi River. So those were some of the main overall principles. And then I had two pins in the map. I said Cumorah is a definite pin in the map because not only Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith, but the succeeding prophets have all said that's where Cumorah was. So I started that with an assumption. And then just to test the theory, I assumed that the area across from Nauvoo was Zarahemla based on DNC 125. And I'm not saying that is where Zarahemla is. I'm saying that that location fits the whole overall geography. So that was the idea, just to offer a different perspective on interpreting the Book of Mormon and to show how it does plausibly fit in this North American setting.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's kind of what, lays the groundwork for, the Heartland stuff. And of course, there's other people that
Right,
have different Heartland models. Yours isn't the only one. There's plenty of other people that have discussed their different models with me. And
right.
and so and so you decided to do this second edition. And of
Hmm.
course you had alluded to that, of course, previously you didn't know too much about Jonathan Edwards and the work that he did,
Right.
and this whole idea of two sets of plates. Maybe just talk about how those influenced this second edition.
Okay. Well, at the very beginning of this, I talk about all the developments that have occurred since the first edition. And I guess the two sets of plays might be the most significant for many people because, in fact, just last night I was at an event, a dinner party, and the people had never, some of them had heard about it and others hadn't. And so I was explaining it, again. And it's amazing when you explain it, it's like the light comes on for people. They say, well, this all finally makes sense because people are having a hard time figuring out where, well, let me back up. For people who aren't familiar with this, so the Book of Mormon is translated from a set of plates. And traditionally, everyone thought there was one set of gold plates that Joseph got from Moroni's stone box in the hill Cumorah. And that included all the abridged plates. That was originally the Book of Lehi through the Book of Moroni. And then there was another set of plates that was the plates of Nephi that were original plates, not abridged. And some those fit in there somewhere in the mix. And it was never clear where because the title page doesn't mention the plates of Nephi. The title page only says that there were abridged plates of Jaredites, abridged plates of Nephites, and then Moroni sealed it with his writings, and that's it. So there was always kind of this mystery about why doesn't the title page refer to the plates of Nephi if the plates of Nephi were included in that set of plates? That was one problem. The second problem was that witnesses described the plates differently. Joseph Smith's father said he weighed them and they weighed 30 pounds. Other people said they weighed 60 pounds. And that's a huge difference. And then you had the issue of the 8 witnesses said they handled all the plates. None of them said there was any sealed portion. You had the issue of Brigham Young saying that Joseph Smith returned the plates to the hill Cumorah, but Joseph said he gave them back to a messenger. So there were all these various discrepancies. Finally, there was in the Doctrine and Covenants in section 9, when the Lord told Oliver Cowdery he tried to translate, wasn't able to. And he said, continue with this work, and then I have other records you can help to translate. And no one knew what those other records were, except that in the very next section, in D&C 10, the Lord says, okay, I don't want you to retranslate the book of Lehi that was lost in the 116 pages. I want you to, now you need to translate the plates of Nephi. But the key to this whole thing is that he didn't have the plates of Nephi at that point. That's why the Lord told him he had to translate the plates of Nephi. So what we've kind of figured out from all the various sources is that when Joseph Smith got the plates from the hill Cumorah, the stone box in the hill Cumorah, that was only the abridged plates that are referred to in the title page. He translated all those in Harmony, Pennsylvania. And then before he left, he gave these plates to a messenger. He called him a messenger. And then David Whitmer came down, picked up Joseph and Oliver from Fayette. And on the way back to Fayette, they passed the same messenger on the side of the road. And David Whitmer asked him if he wanted a ride. And the guy said, no, I'm going to Cumorah. And David Whitmer remembered that specifically because he'd never heard of Cumorah. He didn't know what it meant. And so David Whitmer asked Joseph Smith who this guy was. And Joseph told him, well, it's the messenger. He has the plates. He's one of the Nephites. And so that account used to be widely known in the church. It was in our seminary and institute manuals and everything. And then I don't know who deleted it or what I call decorrelated it, but it's vanished from all the modern versions. It's not in the Saints book. It's not in the lesson manuals and so forth. And it's not in Jack Welch's book called Opening the Heavens. He even deleted it from that, which is appalling. But anyway, so I started wondering, well, why would this messenger be taking the abridged plates to Cumorah before he went to Fayette? And that's when it dawned on me, okay, he was returning the abridged plates to the repository in Cumorah and picking up the plates of Nephi to take to Fayette so Joseph could translate those up there. And then that reconciled all these discrepancies that I've enumerated here.
Hmm.
And it's kind of a cool thing because it does a couple things. First of all, like I said, it reconciles the discrepancies that we had. But it also shows that repository really was in Cumorah, like Joseph or Oliver Cowdery said. He and Joseph Smith had been in there. And he told that to David Whitmer, he told it to Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball and others. So those were two big deals. And it helps us understand the nature of the translation, why he translated the plates of Nephi in Fayette and not in Harmony, and why he didn't translate the abridged plates in Fayette, those kind of things. So that was one development that I put in here. But what that does too is corroborate the whole teachings of the prophets about the hill Cumorah, because they always said the hill Cumorah is in New York, but now we have extrinsic evidence based on what David Whitmer said about it and these other factors that's really where the repository was. So that's why I added it back into this second edition.
Okay. And I think a lot of people are really starting to come around on this whole idea of there being a second set of plates, which I find very
Yeah.
fascinating. And then um, also we could talk about just also even the influence that Jonathan Edwards has had on this and also when you wrote the first edition 8 years ago, were you still thinking what were your reviews on the Seer Stone at that time? I'm trying to
Oh,
remember.
good point. Okay, so around that same time, and I don't remember, I don't think I put it in Moroni's America, but I had it in maybe the Letter 7 book or something. But I had been operating under the idea that Joseph used the Urim and Thummim in harmony, and when he got to Fayette, he used the seer stone, and that's why there was a disparity in the two narratives. And then people were commenting to me, sending me references. We had discussions and so on, and I was finally persuaded that he did never really did use the seer stone to translate, and he did use it for a demonstration. And this all kind of came together when I was reading what Zenas Gurley wrote. Zenas Gurley was an RLDS, I think he was an apostle in their
Hmm.
church. And he went around interviewing everybody to find out what had really happened. And he came to the conclusion that Joseph Smith definitely had a seer stone, but he only used it to satisfy what he called the awful curiosity of his followers. And that makes such perfect sense to me because Joseph emphasized that he was commanded not to show anybody the Urim and Thummim or the plates, or he'd be destroyed, right? And so, how could he explain the translation to people without showing them these objects? So, I think he did a demonstration using the stone and the hat to kind of show, well, this is kind of how it works. And that's as close as he could get. And we wrote a whole book about that actually, Jim Lucas and well, first I wrote one called "The Man That Can Translate," where I talked about it, and then we did one on I think it was called I remember what it's called. I have it here. Oh, by means of the Urim and Thummim. Yeah, and the subtitle is "Restoring Translation to the Restoration." And that's been a controversial book because the interpreter just published 2 reviews of it that we're responding to, and lots of people have been talking about it. And Bushman wrote us a blurb on it because he thought it was great research and so on. So that part was I don't know how much of that I put in the second edition. I know I think I alluded to it and mentioned it because it isn't a focus on the translation itself,
Hmm.
but that's a whole new twist that I didn't know about when I wrote the first edition.
And of course, we've talked extensively about Jonathan Edwards and his
Right.
influence on the text as well. Of course, we've done many interviews on that subject as well. Maybe just briefly summarize that a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. So my wife and I went to Mauritius, which is a country in Africa, to work with a university there. And when we got there, it turned out they needed a lot of governmental interface and permits and stuff. And so my wife was mostly handling that. And I was sitting there thinking, well, I can go to the beach every day or I can do more research. And it was a difficult choice. So, but the beach was awesome, but after a while that gets tiring. So I decided to delve into this whole question about where did the language of the Book of Mormon come from? Royal Skousen famously believes that it was all dictated word for word from the stone. That Joseph had the seer stone that he put in the hat, and the words appeared. He just read them off. Joseph Smith, of course, said he translated by means of the Urim and Thummim by looking on the plates, and there's several references to him having explained that. And so there's a disparity there, and it's been a controversy in the church, and there's a gospel topics essay, and this whole thing just continues on. So when I was in Mauritius, I thought, well, I'm going to make a list of all the non-biblical words that are in the Book of Mormon, which I did.
Hmm.
And I started looking, well, where would Joseph Smith have learned these words? And the idea being that if Joseph actually translated the Book of Mormon, all that language would have had to come from his own mind, just like all of us. Every word that we ever say or read is a word that we've learned, and it's in our minds. Otherwise, we wouldn't recognize it. That's why if you pick up a book that's written in a foreign language, you can't read it because you can't recognize the words, right?
Hmm.
So I figured somewhere in Joseph's environment, he had to have this entire vocabulary. And as I was doing word searches, I started with the Palmyra newspapers, and a lot of that material showed up in there, but there were still gaps, and it kept coming up with Jonathan Edwards as in that time frame as having used these words and phrases. The phrases are more significant than just the words. And I thought, well, Jonathan Edwards, how would Joseph Smith have known anything about Jonathan Edwards, And then I was looking through the list of books that were on sale in Palmyra at the bookshop that Joseph went to every week. And one of them was Edwards' 8 volumes. And as I delved into that, it turns out Jonathan Edwards had a compilation of 8 volumes of his works that was published in 1808 that was on sale in Palmyra. So I bought a set of those original 1808 books on eBay because I don't trust digitized versions. And even it turns out the Jonathan Edwards Center at Yale has a database of all of his work, but there's huge gaps in there. A lot of the stuff that's in the 1808 edition is not in the Yale database.
Hmm.
And I've told them, the people there, and they know about, they're working on it to fix that. But so as I was going through this, it turns out that I haven't quantified it, but it's roughly 80 to 90% of the non-biblical language in the Book of Mormon is directly from Jonathan Edwards in terms of these phrases. And I sat on this for a couple of years because I thought it would be controversial. I figured the critics would say, okay, here's another example of Joseph Smith plagiarizing, right?
Mm-hmm.
The whole narrative of Joseph as an ignorant farm boy that God just appeared to doesn't fit with the Jonathan Edwards stuff. But I shared it with a few people, and they kept telling me, you've got to publish this, you got to publish this. So I finally wrote a book called Infinite Goodness. And I had been corresponding with Carmack and Sorensen a little bit about this. And of course, they said it was crazy and didn't like it and so on, because they were convinced it was all early modern English just from the stone, that Joseph had no influence on it. So when I did the book, it generated a reaction, from the interpreter, the usual suspects. But I think more and more people are coming around to it, partly because Richard Bushman recognized the importance of it. And it turns out, Richard and I had a long conversation about all this. And his first 2 published papers when he was a young, college graduate were on Jonathan Edwards. So he's very familiar with it. In fact, he told me that I should have been around 15 years earlier when they started the Joseph Smith papers, because they were consulting with the people at Yale because of the database and the way they constructed the Jonathan Edwards Center. And they were trying to find a connection between the two, but they didn't see a connection. And now the connection is pretty obvious. In fact, when I have a spare moment, I go through and annotate chapters in the Book of Mormon, and I have that on the MoBOM site where I've annotated several chapters where I show the biblical phrases, the Jonathan Edwards, the phrases that are unique to Jonathan Edwards in the Book of Mormon, and then phrases that are unique to the Book of Mormon. And that might be of interest to your readers. I know when people look at, that's where when it's time for Sunday school, I pull up my website because I can read the Book of Mormon, seeing where the origin of these word terms and phrases. And the reason that's helpful is that it's not just an academic exercise. It's like I always give the analogy of, if you never had the Bible and you read the Book of Mormon, it talks about the law of Moses, but you have no idea what that is because the Book of Mormon doesn't explain it.
Right. Right.
And it's the same with these Edwards concepts, like natural man is an enemy to God. That's an Edwards idea.
Mm-hmm.
And if you didn't know what Edwards said about it, the Book of Mormon phrase is, people have written articles and things trying to explain it. But if you read Edwards' explanation of it, then it all makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And there's far many more of those. That's a simple example. So well, you can put the link on on the notes here to these annotated chapters in the Book of Mormon. It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, we'll definitely have all these. You can send them to me, and I can make sure that we get all these links in the
Yeah,
description that we're talking about, because it's the resources that you provide online is fantastic. There's so much good stuff that you're putting out there.
yeah.
For those of you who are students of history or students of the Book of Mormon, it's a great resources that you provide, and you do a great work with that. I just wanted to ask you, you know, do you think the time will come where your critics will, like the interpreter people and stuff like that? Do you think that progress will ever be made where maybe one day you guys could bury the hatchet and just have some civil dialogue?
Well, I don't have a hatchet. So, I mean, I love, as you see on the background here, I put up this poster that says clarity, charity, and understanding. That's my mantra.
Yeah.
And that's all I'm after. I'm not trying to persuade anybody about anything.
Hmm.
And I started thinking about, well, getting back to the Jonathan Edwards thing is a good example of this, because what the significance of that is not that the language was, from Jonathan Edwards. It's that the Lord prepared Joseph Smith from a young age for his role as a prophet and translator. And, I've shown that he was influenced by what he read as a young boy in Massachusetts when he was recovering from leg surgery, as well as through his days in Palmyra. And that's significant because it shows Joseph Smith is not an ignorant farm boy that God tapped out like the Order of the Arrow and Scouts or something, but that God carefully prepared him from a young age. And I think that's true of all of us, that God prepares us from a young age for whatever our future roles are. And in the case of these scholars at the Interpreter and BYU and Scripture Central and all that, I think they've been prepared from a young age as well, based on their interest and their in various aspects of academia, that the Lord has prepared them to do good work. But they've hit some roadblocks, and it's psychological, I think, where they're in such a small bubble among themselves, and they're constantly they call it peer review, but I call it peer approval for their articles, and they're basically making sure that they all adhere to the catechism of M2C and Sith, Stone on the Hat. And they don't want to venture outside that. And when someone comes along like me and says, wait a minute, let's look at these original sources and take a different interpretation, they kind of freak out. They almost shatter. And it's really unfortunate because if this idea of clarity, charity, and understanding is that we're not insisting everybody agree with us. We want to understand one another. Stephen Covey famously said, seek first to understand and then be understood. And that's what I'm trying to promote with these guys. Why don't you try to understand what I'm saying instead of just knee-jerk attacking it?
And I think that you offer an apologetic defense that is useful because I think what is so interesting is that if somebody wanted to make a naturalistic argument on the Book of Mormon, which I have many times myself,
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
one could go and look at your work and say, well, the Jonathan Edwards stuff kind of proves that there's outside influences on Joseph
Yeah.
Smith. It makes its way in there.
Sure.
But what you do is you're able to kind of um, go up against that argument by saying, well, look, this is actually a good thing. And
Yeah.
see, in other words, yes, what is it? Our understanding of a translator is probably different now than before. Like I think a lot of people in the early days just thought essentially that the writers of the Bible were just kind of receiving dictation from God directly and they were writing it down.
Right.
That's kind of
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
the view was. And I think it was a similar thing with the translation process that Joseph was just kind of this was just this middleman, but basically he was just receiving this information and writing it down without any of his fingerprints on it. Well, now as we understand biblical scholarship, we realize that there's the fingerprints. I tell people the scriptures are directed by the hand of God, but the fingerprints of man are all over it. And
Right. Right.
and so I think now we have a better understanding of translation and how it works and how texts work. That honestly, it actually helps bring in the Book of Mormon into that better understanding of the influences. There's pagan influence, Hellenization going on
Yeah.
in the Bible. There's all these other, you have Paul quoting from a pagan poet,
Right.
in the Bible, right?
Well, and there's anachronisms even in the
Yeah,
Bible,
of course.
Yeah.
So we have all these same issues,
Yeah.
and honestly, I think what it does is it puts the Book of Mormon, it actually puts it in a place of Scripture, how it was produced. It's
That's
a
right.
very useful tool for people who want to understand how Scripture was produced, whether they want to take a naturalistic or they're believers. It's a useful way of looking at it. I think that thinking that Joseph was just reading things off of a rock and wasn't uh the way it's described, it just doesn't make any sense, especially in light of the fact that all the corrections that had to be done to the
Yeah.
and everything like that. It just doesn't hold up. I think your explanations make more sense to somebody who's like an outsider, and it kind of makes
Yeah.
makes the Book of Mormon maybe more plausible as a historical reality, and the translation
Yeah.
process, I guess, is the best way to look at it. So I think you do a great service, and I don't know why people would poo-poo it all the time. I did want to ask you too, is like,
Yeah.
I know you engage people from outside of your faith tradition. You're kind of
Mhm.
an interfaith guy. I know you've told me in the past, you've actually heard from like evangelicals, people from my camp that have really
Sure.
thought highly of your work and maybe gave them a pause. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, it is very interesting because when I have another book called The Rational Restoration, and I think I have, it looks like this, just for your readers if you haven't seen it. And the idea here is it's got reframes of long-held traditions, both by, faithful and antagonistic views that we've inherited over the years. And I'm looking at the original documents and coming up with new versions of it, or new interpretations, what I call reframes. And and a lot of that has to do with appeals to evangelicals and other Christians because they have a very, let's say, jaded or warped perspective of the Restoration. There are areas of Christianity that are restorationists. Jonathan Edwards being maybe the best example of that because he was talking about the restoration of the church in the latter days. And he talked about how God was going to have the church was going to be prosperous and was going to do all these things, which Joseph Smith kind of, I think, incorporated in his understanding of all this. And so evangelicals that I approach with this idea in mind, not just evangelicals, but other Christians too, with the idea that Joseph Smith did translate it, he was inspired, but it is his language. It wasn't a, for many evangelicals, they think that it was a satanic uh, book and it's antichrist and all that. And that's one of the reasons is they say, well, it just came from a crystal ball, basically, you know. And I say, yeah, if it really came from a crystal ball, then I have problems too, because I don't like that idea. That's kind of what we call in our book the Koranization of it, where it's just a pure revelation that he wrote down, and there's no historical basis for it, and so on.
Mhm.
And so I think the stone in the hat is a destructive concept, not only for Christians or evangelicals, but even for members of the church. And that's why E.D. Howe put it in his book, Mormonism Unveiled. He thought that would help to destroy the whole movement. And now our scholars have resurrected it like it's a good thing. It just doesn't make any sense. But basically, I think evangelicals, I won't share names and things, but I had an interesting meeting with a very prominent Christian, a fundraiser guy. And I was explaining some of this stuff to him, and he was very familiar with Mormons, but he said, I have never heard this before. And he said, this makes sense. I like this. And, who knows where that will ever go, but at least it's lowering the barriers between us. And that's our objective. I like this idea that, in fact, I don't know if I should bring this up, but I might as well. So I started writing a book called Zion Without Us. And the idea was that there's people all around the world in all religions and denominations that are seeking for Zion, for a society that our scriptures describe. And we ignore them mostly. And we don't extend a hand to them. In some cases, the church is getting much better, like cooperating with different charities and things. But in terms of establishing that kind of a society where everybody's accepted this clarity, charity, and understanding approach, that's still kind of far off from us, and it's exemplified by our scholars. They are so insular and intolerant that it's really a shame. I look at Scripture Central and I think, man, if that was really what our church was, it would be tough to be part of it because they are so intolerant of other ideas, and it's really too bad because they're all good people. They've just kind of been blinded by their own ideology, in my view.
Yeah, yeah, and it's sad too because of course I've been put in the crosshairs of some of these people as well,
Yeah, that's
and
right.
and
Yeah,
honestly, kind of very
you've had
ugly.
a
I mean,
taste.
yeah, and it's like, whoa, geez, they just I think from the beginning they didn't like me because I was talking to people like you and Rod Meldrum, and they didn't care for that.
Right.
I remember our good friend, we won't bring his name up, but he got all upset. He had 60 subscribers at the time, and even that was too big of a platform for Jonathan
Yeah.
Neville and got obsessed with you over. It was just crazy. And
Yeah,
this is so funny to think back on that whole debacle and everything like that we
I
had.
know.
I
Yeah,
still
it's
find it
crazy.
endlessly amusing myself. But I do think that is the sad part is that actually I've seen it in our camp too.
Mhm.
I recently got attacked, a hit piece done to me by a Christian ministry based in Utah who says that they do research, and
Right.
I could tell this research wasn't that great just based on reading the article they
Sure.
wrote about me. And it's a very similar mindset that I see with
Yeah.
psychologists. It's almost like they're cut from the same cloth. And I I feel bad for them because it's almost like I tell people I said sometimes I want to take like the Jenna Fisher from The Office where you have the picture of Fair Mormon, you have the
Oh,
picture of
yeah.
MRM, and then she says it's the same photo. Because essentially
That's
they do
right.
they're doing the
Yeah, it
same
is.
thing and it's the same spirit. And
Yeah.
it's all there. And I remember last year I went to the presidents of that group and offered to assist them and help them. And instead they chose to try to sabotage me and attack me. And it's just
Yeah.
like it's just so sad that that happens because I'm
Yeah.
like I'm looking for fruits here. I'm a fruit inspector. I don't see any fruits here.
Yeah. Well, it's very similar with Interpreter and Scripture Central because I went to them. I said, look, you guys make a lot of mistakes in your material, and it's because you don't have anybody on the outside looking at it. I'd be happy to anonymously do peer reviews for you.
Hmm.
And when they absolutely refused to have me have any part of that. So that's why I have the Interpreter Peer Reviews blog that I used to do when I would review it myself, which I'm posting some new stuff on this week. And at Scripture Central, I mean, I've known those guys for a long time, and they're really nice guys, but they are so blinded to their own what would I say? I have to say arrogance, I guess, is the only term I can think of. They think if you don't have the right credentials and the right connections that you're contrary to them. In fact, one of them told me we were had lunch and he said, I just have to tell you, we all think you're this much away from being an apostate. They've actually called me an apostate in the past. It's like I'm an apostate because I don't agree with the scholars. I agree with the prophets instead. It's just amazing. But I think over time, my basic life philosophy is eventually the right thing happens. And so I'm pretty confident that I'm not that anybody has to agree with me about anything, actually, just that people will be open their minds to make their own informed decisions and not just defer their faith to these scholars.
Well,
So
speaking of
that's my
scholars,
objective.
you have been recently put out some new work about the Royal Skousen's work, and I'd like for you just to
Yeah.
just talk a little bit about that, the work that you're
Okay.
doing with.
In fact, let me show that book. It's called he has a series called The History of the Text of the Book of Mormon. This is it's 700 or 800 pages. I don't remember, but maybe it doesn't matter. Yeah, 723 pages. And you can see it's a big book
Yeah.
compared to my little book.
Mhm.
It's much bigger. It's thicker, has more material in it. But this is part 7 that just came out within the last couple of weeks,
Okay.
and it's on the early transmission of the text. And it's an invaluable volume because what he does is go through every single change between the 1830 edition and the 1837 and the 1840 edition. And he itemizes them all. He categorizes them all. You can see it's all this real detailed material. It's an awesome book. It's one I've been waiting for a long time, because to have the documentation of all the changes that Joseph and Oliver made to the text, we've had that. The Tanners did that a long time ago, but it wasn't complete and it wasn't as carefully detailed as this is, and it wasn't categorized by grammar and origin and all that. And then he has a section in here on how the text was transmitted from Joseph Smith to his scribes. And that's the one that I have to say is not up to the same standard as the rest of his work. And it's in a chapter called The Witnesses. What is it called? The Witnesses of the Book of Mormon. He has a separate chapter on there. It's about 90 pages where he goes through the what the witnesses said about the translation. And of course, he's a real strong stone in the hat guy. And so he infamously in this book made the statement that Joseph Smith only told partial truth and Oliver Cowdery deliberately misled everybody about the translation because they both said Joseph translated with the Urim and Thummim that came at the plates, and he's saying no, they didn't. That's false. And so, I mean, he's very declarative about that. Even categorizes him as unreliable and all this stuff.
My goodness,
So I thought,
Jonathan, if you had said something like that, they'd call you an apostate.
well, not anymore. They embrace me. That's
Well,
that's
that's
the
true.
irony of this whole
I'm
thing.
saying no. I'm saying outside of the context of that of what they're
Yeah,
saying. I'm saying if
right.
you could say about something in general. Well, Joseph
Yeah,
Smith was not, and Oliver lied, and Joseph Smith was only given a partial truth.
yeah.
Separated from that, just making that statement would be
Right.
something an
You would
apostate would say.
think. Well, and
Yes,
that's what they say the same thing on the geography stuff because they say, well, Joseph was ignorant and he
right.
was misled by this false tradition about Cumorah, New York, and so he adopted it late. I
Yeah,
mean, it's amazing how they get
right.
away with all this.
I know.
And
I know.
so, but I did a blog post saying, thank you, Royal Skousen, because his statement in here about Joseph and Oliver having misled everybody is exactly what the whole thing of the stone in the hat is. So far he's the only one that's been daring and honest enough to say what the reality of that is.
Mm.
All the other people, your Brant Gardners, Jack Welch, those kind of guys, they kind of try to massage it and use sophistry to obscure the point that Royal Skousen made perfectly plain.
Hmm.
And I'm really grateful to Royal for having done that.
Interesting.
At the same time, I kind of fault him because his research is in that area is definitely substandard. And I think I told you I could show you on my blog here where
Yeah. Pull it up.
a post. Should we do that?
Yep. Let's do it.
Okay. So I had sent you this earlier to give you an idea, but can you see it okay?
Yep. And
Okay,
this is
so
Book of Mormon CentralAmerica.com.
yeah,
And
this is a blog I started talking about the geography of the Book of Mormon, the setting of the Book of Mormon. But every so often, I'll also talk about the origin of the Book of Mormon, the translation stuff, because they're kind of connected. The way I see it is both the Stone in the Hat, which I call Sith, and the Mesoamerican two Cumorah series, which I call M2C. They're both premised on the idea that Joseph and Oliver were ignorant and misled everybody about Cumorah and the translation. And so the whole infrastructure of Scripture Central and the interpreter are based on that premise that Joseph and Oliver misled everybody. So where I think they told the truth. And so here I did a review of Royal Skousen's methodology in this part 7 book. And I have an introduction about the ideal of Zion that hopefully everybody could buy into, but apparently not. Then I talked about this. Can you see it okay? Do I need to enlarge it or?
yeah, try to enlarge it a little bit so that yeah,
Yeah, let's see.
there we go. Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, perfect.
I could even do a little bigger and just slide it over, but okay. So, well, let's talk about the Zion thing for a minute because I keep talking about this clarity, charity, and understanding. And the idea there is that when you adopt those three principles, you're living in tranquility. Everything is awesome. You don't have any more contention because contention arises from this idea that you have to make other people agree with you. That's the only reason people contend about stuff. And I talk about one heart and one mind and so on. And then I point out that the first step is clarity, and that's probably the hardest part because people don't like to be clear about what they're saying. But Royal was clear finally, and that really helped. So in this case, I talk about how their work is great. I really love it and I rely on it. But they have an example here of where his research is outcome determined, motivated reasoning, we could say. And it has to do with this account here of another account of Mary Whitmer's viewing of the golden plates. This might be a lot of detail, but we'll go through it and then people can read it if they want. But the idea is when, as I mentioned earlier, when the messenger brought the plates from Cumorah to Fayette, so Joseph could translate the plates of Nephi in Fayette, he showed them to Mary Whitmer, who was David Whitmer's mother. And the reason was that she was feeling overburdened. One account says she was going to kick them out of the house because they weren't helping, in the farm life of the 1830, it was very difficult life, right? 1829, 1830. And so to have extra people coming in that are eating your food and not cleaning up or helping in any way, it was an extra burden. So the angel showed her these plates. And the question was, who was the identity of the angel? Well, Oliver or Royal Skousen here says, for a long time, we have known Mary Whitmer was shown the plates. The accounts are familiar, derived from David Whitmer and John C. Whitmer. And then he gives us this account from John C. Whitmer. I'll outline it so you can see it. This was kind of a clincher for me when I saw this, but it's an account that says, I have heard my grandmother, and then in parentheses, Mary Musselman Whitmer, say on several occasions that she was shown the plates of the Book of Mormon by an holy angel, whom she always called Brother Nephi. And then in parentheses, it says she undoubtedly refers to Moroni, the angel who had the plates in charge.
Mm.
So right here, I said, wait a minute, these guys are saying that Mary Whitmer said it was Brother Nephi, and they're saying she was wrong because it was Moroni. Well, who are they to tell us that her mother was wrong, his mother was
Right.
wrong? And so Worrell recognized the problem when he said, we should note there's some issue about the identity of the angel. Mary Whitmer referred to him as Nephi, but John C. Whitmer identifies him as Moroni. Well, when I read this, it wasn't John Whitmer that did it. It was Andrew Jensen who published this, who put the parentheticals in. And it seems obvious because it was Jensen who inserted the name of the grandmother, and John Whitmer wouldn't have done that. So it's Andrew Jensen looking at this saying, well, Mary Whitmer was wrong, so it had to be Moroni. Well, that took on a life of its own. And later on here, Royal spent 3 pages talking about this family lore that was uncovered, that was published in 1958, I think, where the family was saying that, oh yeah, she said it was Moroni who appeared to her. And I pointed out here on this page, this is where in red, this is the quotation, this is the page from the book where he puts this quotation. And I zoomed in on it so you could see it. But he added this as coming from the earliest account of this event, which was recorded by Edward Stevenson when he interviewed David Whitmer. But then what he didn't do was provide that whole account. And so I showed this. I'm not going to take the time to read this. Your readers or your viewers can do this. But what I showed here at the bottom was the 2 pages from Dan Vogel's early Mormon documents that Skousen cited. This part in orange is the part that he quoted in his book. The part in red he omitted. And this is significant because the part in red is where David Whitmer says Joseph identified the guy as one of the Nephites. It wasn't Moroni. It was one of the Nephites, one of the 3 Nephites, and we know that one of them was likely named Nephi. And in fact, I have a link in here. Brigham Young talked about how Joseph interacted with both Moroni and Nephi and explains the whole thing. But this is just an appalling, or an example of appalling scholarship where Royal Skousen quoted something that confirmed his bias down here, but he deliberately omitted a few sentences earlier that contradicted his whole theory. And so I thought, well, readers need to be aware of what's going on. And this is actually not an uncommon tactic for the apologists at the Interpreter and Scripture Central. They do this kind of thing all the time. By the way, this book was published by Farms, which is interesting. But so that's just one example I gave. And then I have a more extensive review where I'm going through it in this kind of detail regarding the translation as well. Because in order for him to justify his, should I close that now?
Yeah, close that out.
In order for him to justify his stone in the hat theory, he just omits evidence of the Urim and Thummim that is in the historical record. And the other thing, it's fun to have this topic come up because once again, it's an example of where they just accept on its face that last testimony of Sister Emma and the David Whitmer stuff, where we've shown that Joseph Smith III, who interviewed his mother, Emma, and published that account, years later, he wrote a whole discussion of the translation. And he concluded that Joseph Smith used the Urim and Thummim, and David Whitmer was wrong. He didn't even mention his mother's testimony, which tells us how credible he thought that was, And yet the scholars today have resurrected that thing like it's doctrine or something. They basically canonized that last testimony of Emma Smith, which is hilarious. Because when it was first published, it hit the newspapers here in Salt Lake City, and there was front page rebuttals of that last testimony on the polygamy part. And they were even, I think it was Eliza Snow said, well, she doubts Emma even wrote it. It had to be Joseph Smith III that wrote it because Emma would never write something like that, this kind of stuff. And yet today our scholars are all saying, well, she said right here, so it had to be stone in the hat. So that's the way these apologetics work, they just latch onto something and basically, in my view, abuse and manipulate the historical record. So I like this idea of the faith model I keep talking about. Let's just put all the facts out there. And I've brought this up before, even with Dan Vogel, John DeLynn, President Nelson, doesn't matter who it is. Everybody should be able to agree to the facts.
Right.
But distinguishing between the facts and assumptions is very difficult for people, I'm
Mhm.
finding.
Yeah.
For example, Dan Vogel, when on this account of meeting the messenger on the way to Fayette, his interpretation is they just met this old guy and Joseph concocted a story.
Hmm.
That's his version. Obviously, that contradicts what David Whitmer actually said, but that's Dan Vogel's interpretation. So he knows what the fact is, and the fact is David Whitmer made the statement. My assumption is David Whitmer is telling the truth. His assumption is David Whitmer was relating a narrative that Joseph Smith invented.
Okay.
So we can agree on the fact that David Whitmer actually said this, or at least it was recorded. But then from there, our views diverge.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's the same with all the biblical interpretation, with the various doctrinal ideas. If we could get to the point where everybody could agree, okay, here are the facts. Now let's see how our assumptions and inferences diverge from that. And that's how we get to our ultimate worldviews. I mean, that'd be nirvana for me, to have everybody recognize the difference between a fact and an assumption. It's been a challenge, though. I've been talking about this for a few years, and once in a while, someone will finally understand what I'm saying. But as evidence from these latest reviews in the Interpreter, these guys, these uh, LDS, what do you call them, apologists, scholars, whatever, they just don't get the point. It's amazing.
Well, it can be very frustrating. I feel the same way with the Christian apologists that I deal with,
Yeah.
and I'm just like, you know, I tell people, said, I think that the problem I have with a lot of apologists out there, especially in regards to um, Joseph Smith and in general, is if you don't have an imagination,
Hmm.
and if you lack imagination, you'll never understand Joseph Smith. And if you don't understand Joseph Smith, then you don't
Yeah.
understand Mormonism. And I think
Yeah.
creative thinking, thinking outside of the box, being able to take information and bring it in and do what Joseph Smith was able to do, it took,
Hmm.
and he was told he had a great imagination. And I'm not saying he was making stuff up. I'm saying imaginative thinking, thinking differently. That's what made him so,
Yeah.
so different. And so I think what happens with a lot of these apologists is that they don't have an imagination. And if you don't have an imagination, you don't understand Joseph Smith, therefore you don't understand Mormonism.
Yeah.
And I think that people like you think outside of the box, you do have an imagination. You're willing to think differently about things and look at it and
Hmm.
not try to be dogmatic. And I think the dogmatism that has infected Christian apologetics and a lot of the Latter-day Saint apologetics really doesn't do anybody any good because basically nobody is paying attention to them except
I
for
know.
people within their little in group.
Yeah.
Even that hit piece that was done by against me. I haven't
Yeah.
not one single person has come to me and said, Steve, I came across this article because nobody's reading it.
I know.
The only people that know about
Yeah.
it are the ones that I sent the link to and say, what do you think about this? And they're like, oh my gosh, even evangelicals who read it are appalled at the just
Yeah.
how bad it was. And I'm just like, man, try a little harder. And it's so ironic that both you and I have gone to our perspective, even apologetics organizations, and offered assistance,
Yeah.
rebuffed. It's amazing how much our stories parallel in so many
Yeah, it is.
ways.
It is. It is. It's funny. And people ask me all the time, "Well, don't you get upset by all this?" And I said, "Well, why should I get upset? I mean, it's not, first of all, to me, it's kind of funny how ridiculous it is. And because my philosophy, eventually the right thing happens, I'm not worried about it. Eventually, people are going to see between the lines and recognize what these guys have been doing. But it is destructive in the sense that you're talking about, and also within LDS culture, you have these young people who want to be scholars and defenders of the faith and all that. The only place they can get employment is at Scripture Central at this point.
Yep.
And in order to work at Scripture Central, you have to adhere to the orthodoxy. You have to accept the Mesoamerican thing. You have to accept the stone in the hat and all that. And you have to fight against the kind of things that I'm talking about. And you have to accept or basically adopt as your worldview that Joseph and Oliver were wrong about all this stuff. And otherwise, you can't get a job, you know. And it's really, in that sense, it's destructive because it'll perpetuate itself.
First of all, I want to say that I do there are people at Fair Mormon that do watch this channel, and
Yeah.
I've heard some positive things from them. So I don't say I'm not painting people with a
Yeah.
broad brush here. I think there's some good people, wonderful people. I've had Brent Gardner on this program as
Yeah.
well. And so I like to talk to everybody, but I like to also be, people think, well, you're the Switzerland of Mormonism, Steve, and that doesn't mean that I
Mhm.
can't have an opinion, and I
Sure.
take sides or not take
Yeah.
sides, but try to be accommodating. That's like one of my friends said, who was in the military said, yeah, people don't understand that Switzerland pissed off the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold
Yeah,
War.
that's right. Yeah.
So that's really
Everybody
kind
wanted
of
them on their side. Yeah.
exactly. So that's the thing. So just real quick, I part of the reason I bring this up because I love talking to so many people. So tomorrow I'll be interviewing Ed Goebel, who we
Oh
did an
yeah, good.
oral history of the early days of the Heartlander movement was our last interview, and tomorrow we're going to be having a
Yeah.
conversation about evolution. On Thursday, I'm going to be
Okay.
talking to Taylor Petrie, queering kinship in the Mormon
Oh yeah.
cosmos.
Okay.
Okay. And then on Saturday, you and I are going to be interviewing Carrie Schertz of the Backyard Professor to do an oral history of
Yeah.
Fair Mormon, which that's the
Yep.
whole point. I think it's really important to talk to all these different
I love it.
voices, hear all these
Yep.
different perspectives. Somebody like Tyler, he was kind of caught in the crosshairs of somebody that was also attacking me. And it's just sad to see this because Taylor is a well-regarded scholar. And I just wish there was more interaction in the actual scholarly community and these apologetic groups. That's why I kept on going to MRM and said, listen, get involved in the Mormon History Association, and
Yeah.
I'll help you get, with whatever you want to do. I can be a resource for you. Instead, they decided to attack me for attending a Bickertonite baptism the next day, which was crazy. It's just
Yeah, it
insane.
is.
But
It's sad.
it's just so sad to see that, and I felt devastated by that. And then they did their hit piece, but that's okay. We can cover that. So,
Well, let
John,
me follow up on two things that you
yeah, yeah,
said
sure,
here.
please do.
So one was when you talked about inspiration. The way I frame that is having an open mind,
Yes.
because as I think Joseph Smith had an imagination, but it was also more being open. He was a seeker,
Hmm.
and he said when he said he had an intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations, people have interpreted that to mean he knew all the ministers in town, which is not in the historical record at all. And I interpret that to mean he was seeking the truth by reading the writings of all these different denominations, including Jonathan Edwards and others, James Hervey, and so on. And so because he was a seeker, he was open to inspiration from God. And I think that's what made him unique. And I think in our day, we see the same thing. People who are open to inspiration because they're not shackled, let's say, by dogma, then they have a broader view and they're far more tolerant. They're more accepting of other points of view because they enjoy understanding how other people think, which is why I put understanding on here instead of convincing or compelling or anything like that. So that's one point I wanted to make. It's not when you talk about imagination, it is imagination, but it's also being open to inspiration. The other thing you mentioned, Brant Gardner, and I love Brant Gardner. He's one of my favorite apologists. I like him personally, but I also like that he owns his work. He's willing to go out on social media. He's been on your show and other shows to defend it. And you'll see when in my review of his review of my book that I really appreciate that about him. I like that he's willing to stand up for himself and to articulate his thoughts. He's also, unfortunately, though, he's tainted by that Dan Peterson approach to apologetics, where it has to be kind of snarky and all that, which I used to love to do also in the early days, just to kind of liven things up a little bit. But now I'm more into this clarity, charity, and understanding. I assume everybody's acting in good faith. That's what the charity is. I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I just want to understand. And then, but most of all, I seek clarity. I want people to be crystal clear about what they are really saying and what they really believe, what their assumptions and inferences are. And that's proving to be the biggest challenge right now. It's the same with Christians, with the evangelicals, that they don't really get too specific about their assumptions and inferences because they take it as accepted fact. And that's just a universal problem. I was thinking about this. Okay, why did the Jews reject Christ in the first place? Is the fulfillment of all the prophecies. And it was because it wasn't what they expected. It wasn't what they had grown up with, and they didn't have an open enough mind. A few of them did, and that's why they became disciples. But the ones who had these closed minds and were convinced that they were right and everybody else was wrong, those are the ones who rejected Christ. And we see that same pattern throughout the world in every culture and every religion and every political philosophy. And I think it's what you're doing as being the Switzerland of this arena is helping people open their minds. You're not telling them they have to believe one thing or the other. You want to expose people to different thoughts. You want them to have an intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations, like Joseph Smith did. And if we took that as a little bit of a catchphrase where we say, let's have an intimate acquaintance with those who have different opinions from us, that's a productive um, Zion-like approach that I'm excited about. I love it, and I love what you're doing. And I think you've made a big impact. Well, we know you've made a big impact, but it's continuing. Now that you're back with us,
Yeah.
you had that spell where you were gone, but I'm
Yeah.
delighted to see the people you've lined up to interview, and I think it's going to continue to be productive.
Yeah, between my hearing loss and hurricanes, I've affected
Yeah,
2.5 months worth of programming this year. I mean, that's just
yeah.
been crazy. But yeah, and we're crawling, what am I saying, clawing our way back into this whole into this
Okay.
whole space as well. And I just want to say I'm very thankful. This is the holiday season. I'm just thankful for everybody's thoughts and prayers that have been directed towards me and my mom.
Mm.
My mom hopefully will be released from the rehab facility later this week. She broke her hip, and
Cool.
she's doing really well. And I just want to thank all the love that's been thrown our way from so many people and wonderful, wonderful, lovely people. Virtually all Latter-day Saints have just reached out, and a few evangelicals have too. And I want to thank them. Even some of
Good
my
for them.
critics have shown some kindness for once, and I do appreciate that. So the book is Moroni's America 2.0, or the second edition, and I read some chapters that you had recommended that I read, and it was very helpful and informed this conversation. I just want to
No,
point out,
oh, go ahead. But
well, there's
there's
richly
something I forgot
illustrated.
that I meant to bring up, but go ahead.
Yeah, please. Oh, well, I'm just gonna say it's a beautiful book, richly illustrated, and I think it's a great for those of you who even are outsiders who want to kind of get like an understanding of, if you're really interested in the different models of the Book of Mormon and you want a really good articulation of the Heartland model, this would be a good place to start. And what were you going to say, Jonathan?
Two things. I was going to point out that throughout the book, there are QR codes that
Yep.
you can scan, and it'll take you to additional bonus material. So it's a book, but it's also interactive on the internet. We have a lot of additional material. And the second thing is one of the most important reasons I did the second edition was to point out that the Book of Mormon, even though the events took place in North America, it was not written for North America. And this is where some of the Heartlanders, I think, have gone a little too, I don't want to say patriotic, a little too focused on the United States.
Hmm.
Because even though I labeled this Moroni's America because that was where the events took place, but in the book I talk about Moroni's Vietnam, Moroni's Pakistan, Moroni's Brazil, because the promises of the Lord, the covenants of the Lord that the Book of Mormon talks about apply to every country, every nation, every people. And this is a big change that took place in the church in the 1970s because in the early days of the church, they wanted everybody to gather to Zion in
Right.
Missouri or Illinois and then Missouri, or Missouri and then Illinois, and then eventually to Salt Lake, right?
Right.
So converts came from Europe primarily all the way to Salt Lake. And that was the gathering place for the first 100 and some years. And it continued to be the gathering place, although the church leaders started encouraging people to stay in their home countries for a while. But finally, I think it was in the 1970s, President Lee announced that no longer is America the gathering place. Now the gathering place for the saints is in your home countries. And that was really a fulfillment of the prophecies in the Book of Mormon that it took about 150 years for that to happen, but it was a fulfillment of those prophecies. And that's something that I emphasize with Heartlanders, that the United States was formed and blessed to be the site of the restoration, but those same blessings apply to people all around the world. And other countries are awesome also.
Hmm.
It's not just the United States. And that I've lived in Africa and China and Europe, and I've traveled to over 100 countries. And everywhere I go, there's awesome people that enjoy the full blessings of the gospel. Now there's temples everywhere. And so it's Moroni's America, but it's Moroni's the world.
Hmm.
And I make that point in the book because it's something that a lot of people have overlooked or haven't really thought about too much. President Nelson's emphasized it, but I just want everyone to know that wherever you live in the world, your country has the same blessings and opportunities that America has.
Great, that's awesome. And the other one I remember is there's
Oh, QR code.
QR
Yeah.
codes throughout, and so it is an interactive. That's why you want to get the second edition if you already have the first edition, because there's more
Yeah.
uh, access to more information, and it's an
Yeah.
updated edition of this fantastic book. Really appreciate the work that
Cool.
you do, Jonathan.
Well, thanks so much, Steve. It's been fun being with you.
Yep,
Oh,
it's
the
always
map.
great
Yeah.
talking about Moroni's America here at on Mormon Book Reviews. Well,
There
Jonathan,
you
thanks
go.
for coming on to the program.
Yeah. Been fun.
We're gonna have provide links for some of the stuff that we discussed in today's episode, and also for that we'd love to hear your comments. I love it when people when I have Jonathan on, it always brings out great conversations and great people. And also just want to thank those of you who are financially contributing to the channel or supporting us. There are links in the description for those of you who'd like to do that as well. Couldn't do it without you. Also, our website, MormonBookReviews.com, is available with a merch store. And remember, the most important thing is this: all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.